Hi, I'm Mike Bellevue, and today we're back in the shop. And today I want to talk about the evolution of Smith & Wesson's No. 3 revolver. And we're going to take that from its revolutionary beginnings as the .44 American model up to its final evolution as the new model No. 3. These are fascinating revolvers, and they definitely were groundbreaking. The .44 American ushered in the metallic cartridge handgun era in the United States. So let's take a look at Smith & Wesson's No. 3 revolver. In 1855, Smith & Wesson acquired the rights to the Roll & White patent. They licensed it from Roll & White. And that gave them a lock in the United States on the metallic cartridge revolver market, because the Roll & White patent controlled the completely bored through chambers in a revolver cylinder that were necessary for brass cartridge firing. Now, it's kind of interesting, that patent probably never should have been granted by the United States Patent Office, my belief. And Roll & White could not get a patent in England or in Europe because other examples of bored through cylinders predated his patent. But he got one in the United States, and that actually retarded the development of American firearms for about a decade or so. So while Smith & Wesson had the patent locked up, the only cartridge firing firearms they were making were small bore, 22 caliber rimfire and 32 caliber rimfire guns. These were tip-up barrel guns. They were a very weak design, but they were still incredibly popular because they were cartridge firing. And during the Civil War, quite a few officers bought them for personal use, even though they were underpowered. In 1869, Smith & Wesson launched this gun, the No. 3. This was their first big bore gun. It differed from their earlier designs in a number of ways, not the least of which is that the hinge was at the bottom of the frame instead of at the beginning. And instead of poking the empties out one at a time, it was the first gun that had simultaneous ejection. So this is a revolutionary design. Now, why Smith & Wesson did not come out with this gun during the Civil War, I don't know. Because if they had, I can guarantee it would have sold at least 100,000 revolvers. This would have been in huge demand because it's so much more reliable than the paper cartridge firing cap and ball guns that were used throughout the war. But they didn't. 1869 is when this came out, and it immediately changed the landscape. Now, Smith & Wesson had hoped to sell the No. 3, which was generally known as the .44 American model. They had hoped to sell that to the United States Army. And the Army did, in fact, place a small order for testing. But they deemed the gun too delicate for field use. That's something that Smith & Wesson would disprove with other military contracts. But nonetheless, it was the first metallic cartridge firing sidearm to be purchased by the U.S. Army. Now, the No. 3 entered full-scale production in 1870. In 1872, Smith & Wesson made some changes to it. And the major change was to increase the diameter of the trigger pin. They also replaced the steel front sight with one made of German silver, and these became known as the second model .44 American revolver. And this gun was fairly popular on the frontier and enjoyed decent sales for the time. I mean, the fact is, it's a little ungainly. They made it in an 8-inch barrel because they were looking for military contracts, and at the time, you know, the Colt Army revolver and the Remington New Model Army had 8-inch barrels. The grip frame is quite straight up and down, which makes it point a little bit low naturally. And that, coupled with the very, very barrel heavy gun and the tiny front sight, the tiny rear sight I should say as well, made it not the fastest gun to use. But it was quite reliable. The 44 American cartridge, actually was a 45, was a heel-based round, outside lubricated, like the 38 long Colt. And that would prove to be an unpopular choice in this gun as time went on, and brass cartridges modernized rapidly. But a lot of people use these on the frontier. So the next step in the number 3's evolution were the so-called Russian models. So the next step in the number 3's story are the Russian models. And this is kind of an interesting story because it really sidetracked Smith & Wesson for a while and took their eyes off of the American market. And what happened is really pretty simple. You know, they were the firstest with the bestest, you might say. And the Russian government got wind of that. And they sent an army captain over to inspect the guns and to enter into a contract with Smith & Wesson if he felt that they were going to be acceptable for Russian army use. So on May 1st, 1871, the Russian government ordered 20,000 number 3 revolvers. And these were essentially exactly the same in appearance as the 44 American models. They didn't have the iconic spurred trigger guard or the humpback grip or any of that stuff at the time. They were really 44 Americans, but they were chambered for a different cartridge because the Russians did not like the archaic 44 American outside lubricated cartridge. They wanted an inside lubricated .429 bullet using the same case, slightly lengthened, as the 44 American. And that became the 44 Russian round. And that round was used heavily throughout the 19th century, and it was especially popular with target shooters. The Russians placed many more orders with Smith & Wesson, ultimately getting up to about 130,000 revolvers. And over the course of time, they requested several major design changes. And those design changes gave us the classic 44 Russian top break profile that we're used to, with the hook on the trigger guard, with the narrower grips that had the hump at the top, the pawl, which was to keep the hand in position shot after shot. Somewhat shortened ejector assembly, made improvements in the ejector assembly. The ejector assembly on the 44 American is kind of clunky. It's actually a gear and pinion system, which is why it's so long. So over time, until we get to the new model number 3, you'll see that the ejector housings under the barrel get shorter and shorter and shorter. Smith & Wesson had very little production capability left over for the civilian market for big bore revolvers. Though some did get to the market, and typically the way that happens, and we'll see this again with the Schofield, is there would be guns that the Russian inspectors would reject. Now, it doesn't mean the guns were bad. They might not have liked the finish on them. There might have been some other little issue. Maybe they had a ding or scratch, a dent. And the Russians rejected them for the contract. Now, rather than throw those guns in the bin, what what Smith & Wesson would typically do, and this is the same thing that Colt would have done and anybody with a military contract, is they would take those guns and quite often nickel plate them, which was very popular in the civilian marketplace. and it also covered up some of the small blemishes, maybe in finish on the guns that might have got them rejected. So they'd nickel plate them and then sell them on the civilian market. This is quite common. So the Russian models were out there, and the feedback Smith & Wesson was getting from their distributors was that people didn't like them. Interestingly enough, a distributor in Texas wrote to Smith & Wesson saying, I'll take all the old models you can put out here. People want those. People prefer your Smith & Wesson's 2 Colt single-action Army revolvers. But they don't like the Russian model. They don't like the trigger spur. They don't like the grip because it's a more difficult to reach the hammer with your thumb, which slows up your shot. They don't like that. But they'll take the ones with the old model, kind of the the plow handle type frame, as many as you can put out. But of course, Smith & Wesson wasn't making those anymore. They were making the Russian grips like this. So that posed a bit of a problem. So they really were losing their civilian big bore market. But they had this huge contract with the Russians, so like, what's the worry? And the answer was there was plenty for them to worry about. I've worked in acquisition for the government, for the military, kind of on both sides of the fence. I worked on the requirement side, the logistics side for the Navy. And then when I retired, of course, I was a consultant. And as a consultant, I had to secure contracts for myself and for my crew from the Navy and from the Army and from private entities. And I used to tell people that the government can be your best customer, and at the same time, they are probably going to be your worst customer. And believe me, I found that to be absolutely true. And as bad as that could be for the United States government, try it for the 19th century Imperial Russian government. Because the Russians decided that they knew enough about the number 3 revolver, after buying close to 100,000 of them, that they could make them themselves. Why pay Smith & Wesson to do it? So they made a calculated risk that Smith & Wesson was very far away on another continent and would not sue them in Europe. And if they did try to sue them, they would have to sue them in Russia, and the Tsar owned the courts, so they were just going to lose. So Russia flat out stole the number 3 Russian design to produce themselves. In 1876, they gave the design to Ludwig Loh in Berlin to manufacture Russian revolvers for them. No licensing contract, no royalties to Smith & Wesson, no nothing. They just stole it. And while Loh was making guns for them in Berlin, they were gearing up their Tula factory, their arsenal, basically, factory, to make them in Mother Russia, which they did. And they cut out Smith & Wesson entirely, and they canceled their last few contracts, and they precipitated a financial crisis at Smith & Wesson because, of course, the Russians had been by far their biggest customer. And now they were gone. And not only were they gone, but they had stolen the market on their way out. So, a rough day for Smith & Wesson. Now, while all this was going on, another issue came up. And this is another development in the number 3. But it was not a development that Smith & Wesson welcomed. And, these days, the Smith & Wesson Schofield You know, I believe that many shooters today, or many Old West aficionados today, believe that this was Smith & Wesson's most popular top-break revolver, because this is the one that so many reproductions are made of, right? And it was a cavalry gun. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The truth is actually a pretty sordid tale. And I've told this story before. And when I told the deep dive back about a year ago into the Schofield revolver. So if you want it in all its gory detail, you can go look it up there. But in a nutshell, what happened is Major George Schofield, whose brother was the commanding officer of the Ordnance Board, had a better idea for a cavalry revolver. So the problem with guns like the American is, in order to open the action and to put it on half cock, one hand lifts up this latch, right? You see the latch, and then it opened, right? So if you're trying to, you know, guide a cavalry horse into battle at the same time, that was an awkward proposition. What George Schofield did is he bought about a dozen 44 American revolvers, and he took them to a custom gunsmith and had him make a new latch to Schofield's design. And that latch is like this, and it works by pulling it straight back. I don't want, these are dummies, by the way, snap caps. I don't want to pull them all out. But basically, you could open the gun with one hand on a plunging horse to reload. That's handy, no doubt about it. So he thought he had a much better design. That right there is the basis of Schofield's changes. So he bought a bunch of American revolvers, and paid a gunsmith to modify them with his latch. While he was doing that, Smith & Wesson had launched a protest about the selection of the Colt Single Action Army during the 1873 trials. The protest probably would have gone nowhere if it wasn't for George Schofield. But the Ordnance Board agreed to reopen the trials, which Smith & Wesson, very happy, right? So they submitted their Russian model to the trials. However, by reopening the trials, they opened the door for Schofield to submit his revolver, which they had not expected. In fact, they were completely blindsided. So the trials go on. The Russian model is rejected by the government. But the Schofield modified model is accepted. Of course, Schofield has no factory. It's a Smith & Wesson gun that he modified. So the government basically went to Smith & Wesson and said, hey, we want you to make these. And Smith & Wesson wanted to keep the government sweet, but they were unhappy about this. I mean, very unhappy. They did not want to manufacture Schofield's design. And they knew they were going to be working on an improvement themselves fairly soon. And they would rather have competed on that basis. But this is where nepotism won out. So Smith & Wesson took the contract to make the Schofields. But they did not plan on giving Schofield any money for that. And of course the Ordnance Board came back and said, wrong, Smith & Wesson. You're going to give Major Schofield 50 cents a revolver as a royalty for using his design. which they had to do. And in fact, they just raised the price from $13 per revolver to $13.50. But they were determined to make sure that Major Schofield collected as few 50-cent pieces as possible. So they really did not lobby hard for another government contract. In fact, they, I think, tried to kill the deal because the government asked them to lengthen the frame to take the .45 Colt, frame and cylinder. And they said, no thanks. But we'll design a shorter .45 cartridge that'll work in this gun, which they did, the .45 Schofield, which then caused logistics problems for the Army until they developed a single cartridge that would work in both guns. But I think Smith & Wesson was hoping that the Army would just say, well, then we'll just cancel the contract. But they didn't, so they made these Schofield guns. Even though those guns would have sold like hotcakes out west, they did not offer them for commercial sale. Now, there were some commercial sales, a tiny number of them. And that's for the reasons I told you before. They were rejected guns that were then sold on the civilian market. So I think the initial batch of civilian guns was like 50 revolvers. And it looks like the total number of guns sold on the civilian market, Schofield models, were only 500, which is really just a drop in the bucket. Smith & Wesson was not interested in making or selling the Schofield Model 3, number 3. And they definitely showed their disdain. And as a result, Major Schofield never made any real money off of this gun, and he subsequently committed suicide at a fairly young age. Well, that leads us to the final number 3 revolver, which is known as the new model number 3. Smith & Wesson started designing this gun in 1876. And they applied all of their lessons learned in making the Russian model to designing the new model number 3. And of particular interest to Smith & Wesson was the grip design. They did not feel, contrary to some of their customers, that the plow handle grip of the American model and of the Schofield model was the best way to go with a revolver. But they recognized the unhappiness of the American market with the Russian grip. And the main complaints were, hate the spur and the trigger guard. Okay, that's easy. But also the grip was too straight up and down. And that pawl, that hump at the top of the grip, made it very difficult to quickly cock the action. It put you farther away from the hammer, basically, and was in your way. But Smith & Wesson knew that pawl did some good because it helped to keep the hand in exactly the same position shot to shot, which was an aid to accuracy. So they redesigned it, and they actually tested out the new design on the .38 Smith & Wesson single-action break-top baby Russian revolver. And that was a hit. So they just upscaled that grip a little bit to use on the new model number 3. And I've got to say, it is a very comfortable grip. I think better than the Schofield grip, which is also pretty comfortable. New model number 3 also had a revamped ejector system, which allowed for a much shorter housing, so it's a much more streamlined looking gun. What they did do for the new model number 3 is they retained the two-handed latch system, right, for doing your ejection. Once again, these are snap caps. They did not use the Schofield system and they would never use that on another revolver. So even though many people think it's superior to this system, I'm not one of those people, by the way, but many people think it is. That was never used again. Now, why don't I think it's superior? You can't open it with one hand. However, and I've done this myself, so and other people have too, it is quite easy to draw a Schofield revolver, and when you're reaching for the hammer, to actually pull that latch back and have the gun swing open and dump all your rounds. That would be a bad day if you were in a gunfight. I mean, the best thing about the Schofield latch is the sight itself, because typically sights on these guns are little tiny pitons that stick up that you can hardly see at all, and very difficult to get a quick sight picture with. But on the Schofield, Major Schofield made an excellent combat rear sight. It's very positive, it's repeatable, it's easy to acquire, it's very good. Now, on the new model number 3, Smith & Wesson put that little tiny sight on as standard, but you could get it with a target sight, which is what this one has, which was drift adjustable for windage. And it's an excellent sight, and it truly makes these a joy to shoot, because you can get a good fast sight picture. Excellent. Now, the new model number 3 went into production in 1878, and it became quite popular, and it was used as a fighting handgun. In fact, it was used by several militaries. It was used by the Turks, by the Japanese. It was used by some police forces. I think St. Louis used it. Australia used it to equip their police forces. So it was a fighting gun, but it really got its claim to fame as a target revolver. And in fact, it was the first revolver to seriously challenge the single-shot target pistols of the day. And in fact, it made the single-shot pistols obsolete. And shooters using a new model number 3 set records that stood for 100 years. And, part of that is because of the ergonomics of the gun, but also the trigger is excellent. It's very crisp. It has no over travel, breaks beautifully. The hammer fall is very short. A Colt Single Action Army's hammer fall is tremendously long. It's why one of the reasons why they developed the Bisley for target shooting, which has a much shorter hammer throw, because that long hammer throw can really throw off your shot. But the new model number 3 had a very short hammer throw, a very fast lock time. It just set records left, right, and center. Now, most of them were made in .44 Russian. That was the standard caliber for it. But 38 Long Colt was also a popular target round in the new model number 3. Perhaps the most famous new model number 3 revolver, chambered in 38 Long Colt, was owned by Theodore Roosevelt. When he was Secretary of the Navy, he ordered this gun as he was resigning to start the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. He went to Smith & Wesson. He ordered an engraved new model number 3 in 38 Long Colt, which was, of course, the Army's official chambering at that time. And that was going to be his gun for the Spanish-American War. And ultimately, he did not carry that during the war because he was given a model 1892 revolver that was salvaged from the wreckage of the USS Maine, which of course blew up in Havana Harbor and was one of the things that precipitated the war. It was believed that the Spanish had sabotaged it. In point of fact, there's quite a bit of controversy about that. It may well have suffered a boiler explosion and not sabotage. But at any rate, Roosevelt got one of those guns, and that's what he carried up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and into fame and glory. But this is the gun that he ordered to take to that war. It's beautifully engraved and just a beautiful example of a new model number 3 in .38 caliber. Now, the new model number 3 was available in either blued or nickel finish, and it was actually available from the factory in a pretty wide range of barrel lengths. Though, from what I have seen, decades of going to antique gun shows and examining, I couldn't tell you how many Smith & Wesson new model number 3s. I would say that the 7-inch barrel is by far the most common. But they were available from the factory in 3.5 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches, 6 inches, 6.5 inches, 7 inches, 7.5 inches, and 8 inches. So you had quite a range of choice on barrel length. Now, in 1885, Smith & Wesson extended the cylinder in the frame to accommodate the 4440 cartridge, and they called that the Frontier model. And pretty much everybody who made a gun in the 19th century made one chambered in 4440, because thanks to the Winchester 1873, the 4440 was available anywhere, and it was pretty much ubiquitous. So Smith & Wesson took a crack at it. And I think by 1885, the magic of the 4440 might have been wearing off, because the new model number 3 in 4440 was a failure. They sold very few of them. And in fact, they ended up taking their remaining unsold guns and making new cylinders for them that were chambered in 44 Russian, which they were able to sell. So, go figure. Now, I told you that these were a target shooter's delight. In 1880, American shooter Ira Payne was competing in Europe, and he was destroying all the European target shooters, and he was using a Stevens single-shot pistol. So the French started experimenting with the new model number 3 in 44 Russian, and they liked the results that they were getting, and they were going to challenge Payne using that pistol. Now, Ira was no dope. He had gotten a new model number 3 himself and was experimenting with it, and he decided that that was more accurate than his single-shot Stevens. And he went on to clean the clocks of just about every European shooter for the next couple of years. Made a fortune that he brought back to America. The new model number 3 was the last single-action revolver made by Smith & Wesson. They made about 65,000 of them. And they made them until 1912, but all of the frames, this is kind of interesting, all of the new model number 3 frames were manufactured before 1899, which means they all have antique status, even if they were assembled after 1899. So any new model number 3 can be bought as an antique firearm. It's one of the cool things about it. You can get clones now made by Uberti of the American model, of the Russian model, of the Schofield, but you can't get a clone of the new model number 3. Beretta made one briefly, which is actually this gun right here, the Beretta Laramie, and it's excellent. But because SAS would not allow it in the traditional category because they said it had an adjustable sight, which is kind of a misnomer. I mean, it's drift adjustable, but it's not like a micrometer rear sight on a Ruger. But because of that, it really killed the popularity of the gun. In order to use them in the traditional categories, which is where you would want to, you would have to get a Uberti Russian rear sight and replace the rear sight on the Beretta Laramie. So kind of killed the popularity, but you can find them on the used market. So all of those guns are available as replicas, and they are well worth checking out. So I hope you enjoyed our look at the evolution of the number 3. And if you did, hit that like button, hit subscribe, and you might catch us on Patreon, and we can use the support right now. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time, bye.